Hello, my name is Patrick Wells, and I'm going to introduce a unit in my ESL course book, Unit 13, about famous people. This is how I would start the unit, and let's get started real quickly. A quick overview of this unit I'll be discussing. This is for the Cambridge International General Certificate Secondary Education English Second Language course. I'm teaching grade 10. We use a Lucatoni textbook. It's very popular for this course. I see my students, once a day, 5 times per week for 5 40-minute lessons. So each lesson will be about 40 minutes. And just a general note, the local policy, education policy here prohibits computer use for grade 10 students, except for limited computer lab access. So you'll see that we don't use a lot of technology in our school because we are not allowed. So to start this unit, because this will be a brand new unit. Most units begin with some kind of vocabulary work. So I would start by preloading unit vocabulary and doing some speaking practice with that unit, with that vocabulary, because speaking is very important for the ESL exam. It is a quarter of their final assessment, so it's very important to them. For the assessment for this day, I would have the students be a written assessment where they would write a summary of what they read about using this unit of vocabulary. And if you want to see more detailed lesson objectives, please read my lesson plan, the unit plan. I'm only hitting a few of the highlights for each lesson. I'm not going to go extremely in depth for every activity for every day on this video here. To preload the unit vocabulary, what I would do is I would introduce a famous person that I admire using the vocabulary. I would not point out this is the unit vocabulary yet, but they would just hear it being used. And then you can see on this big white square here, this is a screenshot from our workbook. And the activity is pretty basic. It's, there's a circle there and there's 12 vocabulary words in there. And students just have to circle the vocabulary words. It's kind of hard for some of the ESL students, but they'll figure that out. They just find them. And the next activity is after they identify the words, is the meanings, right? They find the definitions. And I didn't put that up on this slide here, but this is a basic synonym match exercise. So the next page of the workbook, they have a synonym, and they have to just match the vocabulary word to it. Now, one way I would differentiate this activity, I do this for a lot of activities, is what resources I make available to my students. And in this context, right, for this one, my highest level students, I wouldn't give them any resources to do the vocabulary matching. If they know the word, great. If they don't know the word, because that's okay too, they have to go find someone who has resources. Now, my middle group of students, I would give them access to dictionaries with vocabulary and definitions. And that's it can be a little difficult for them because they can look up the word, but then they have to translate the definition and kind of reduce that down into a single synonym, which is in their textbook, in their workbook, I'm sorry. And my lowest level students, I would give them access to a thesaurus. And for them, it's simply look up these vocabulary words and look for the list of synonyms and then match one of those to whatever's in the text in our workbook here. And at each level, they're using the resources properly, but some of them are doing more cognitively difficult activities based on how much experience they have with the English language. So after the students have done the preloading the vocabulary, they've done the identification, the matching synonyms, they would just have a speaking practice. Here is a prompt from our course book. I don't use the video, so I ignore the watch and listen part. But I would use these prompts to have them talk with their partners, and I'd be monitoring the entire time, being sure that they are using the unit vocabulary in their speaking, right? And then, as you saw, and then for homework, their quick assessment assignment would be to write a short summary using these vocabulary words about some famous person that they admire. Now, the next day, lesson 2, now we're starting to reading. We're going to read about a guy named Eusebio. He's an old footballer, and we do some note-taking practice. So here are some of the basic ideas for the objectives, where we're going to practice our scanning strategies. We're going to do a little bit of reading comprehension, and we're going to focus on note-taking and identifying headings for note-taking. And this assessment is going to be a notebook check. I do a lot of notebook checks so I can see if they're actually writing things down like I asked them to. So I said I'm only going to hit some of the highlights of each lesson, and in this lesson I think the highlight is the opening, where I would present this. Now this is a map of the Portuguese Empire, for those of us who are not history majors. And this is important for this lesson because Eusebio, he was born in Mozambique back in the 1940s, so which was still part of the Portuguese Empire. So he played for the Portuguese World Cup team. And that's something I'm sure my students don't know. And I'm trying to do a little bit of cross-curricular add a little history to this. And then this would lead into one of the essential questions where I might open up with this, or I might like end the lesson with this. But compare Eusebio to a Kernath that you enjoy. That's basic. That's easy enough. But this one here is like, how would you feel playing for representing a foreign country that colonized your homeland? That's probably a heavy topic that they've never really thought of before. And I think that would be a good way to make them think about like a little more global picture, the bigger ideas, a little bit of history stuff. And the text about Eusebio mentions in the text that he was born in Mozambique as was a Portuguese colony. So it's important that my students understand what colonization means in this context, because they probably, like, my students don't come from a land where they've had foreign, Europeans colonizing the land for hundreds of years. So they just don't have that experience, and they don't learn as much about that, I don't believe, as a lot of other students do. So, when we do our scanning exercise, I'm not going to post up the Eusebio text, but what we will do is the scan strategy I always try to teach them is read the questions first and think about what type of information is necessary for that question. Like, for example, the first one here is, what was Eusebio's nationality? Well, you read that, and the type of information you need a country or like adjective for a country. So that's really fast. So then we would just go through the text and we would scan. Are there any country names? Circle all of them. We're not going to like answer the question yet, but that's a strategy I teach with my students. What type of information do we need? Okay? So they would do that the first time. They would run through that, they scan it. And then after that, we move on to, we would go over as a class, a little open class feedback. They'd answer the questions with a close read. Then we would do the note-taking section, where you kind of see here, in this blue box, there's 5 potential headings for note-taking, for the notes. But only 3 of these are relevant to the Eusebio text. So what the students have to do is, they would, we work as a class, work together, identify which of these headings are relevant to the text, and then within those headings, they have to make their 3 notes, because note making is one of the writing assessments on the writing exam at the end of the year. You can see here the little top tip. Top tips are throughout the Louis Tony textbook, where they discuss just tips. And what I do is I usually read them aloud and have the students follow along with me, or sometimes I'll nominate a student to read it if I want to get a little extra oral fluency practice and make everyone follows. But this one reminds them what a note actually is, because when I do my notebook check, I'll be checking, are the notes concise? I don't want them copying entire sentences, because if they do that, that's not a note, that's just copying. All right, so we're moving on to our third lesson, our third day here, and now we're doing some reading, another reading text about Helen Keller this time, and we're looking at discourse markers. And this is a 2-part lesson, basically. It's going to be like, Wednesday, Thursday. So there's no real assessment for it. There's going to be an assignment at the end they do for homework, but that's going to be more of a lead into the next lesson than anything I'm really assessing. But in this one, we're going to be reading and identifying unknown vocabulary. We do a lot of that because vocabulary is a weak point for many of my students. They struggle there. And there's a few closed sentences that's going to help students develop our topic sentences. And topic sentences, we do this, but we focus more on just the vocabulary for this exercise here. So in this one, lesson 3, we're going to do I call it reading it twice, reading it thrice sometimes, reading it 4 times. I just make kind of a joke out of my students how many times we're going to read something. And this first time, because we're doing vocabulary work a lot, this is the first, they're going to skim through text and just quickly circle any vocabulary word they don't know. Okay, if they can't understand it immediately, they circle it. They don't look it up or anything. And then after we do that as a class, we work together. We make a big word bank on the whiteboard. I have students come up to the whiteboard and write the words they don't know. And we spend about 10 or 15 minutes, if it takes, discussing each word. Sometimes we look them up in our dictionaries or our thesauruses, to find these meanings. And once everyone has all these meanings to all these, vocabulary words that they might not have seen before, then they can closely read the texts and they complete the topic sentences of each paragraph, which is the actual exercise in our course book, which you will see right here. Like here's an example. Here's like the first paragraph, and you see, dot dot dot. They're missing a few letters there, a few words there. At the end of the text, which the first paragraph, they have this. These are um, the choices they have to fill in each blank. There's more choices than there are blanks, so it's not just just quick basic matching. It's a little bit of reading comprehension there. Okay, but that's our close activity. So after completing the close activity, I would get them into their workbooks, and this is basically their homework. And this is maybe a little controversial, but I sometimes assign work in a workbook without a whole lot of context or a lot of teaching around it before they work, because I want to see where my students are, like what they already know. But when I do this, always like the opening of the next lesson is like a in-depth 15-minute discussion feedback about it, and we find out if we need to teach it. I start teaching it there. So in this one, it's going to be like, what are these discourse markers? I'd explain it real quickly, but basically, here's the page. You do it, make it happen. So now we're to the fourth lesson on day 4 here, and we're gonna continue reading the Helen Keller text, working with, and now this is the second part of our discourse markers. And this one is we're gonna identify and use discourse markers to link ideas, and then I'm gonna have the students create their own sentences using discourse markers. And the assessment here is going to be some notebook and workbook checks. And the workbook check is where I'm going to differentiate things, which I will talk about in a moment. So the way I would differentiate this would be based on their workbook work they did for homework, right? And in that workbook, if you can remember, it was they were given, they had to write their own sentences using different discourse marker language, but some of it could be repeated if they would like to. And for my highest level students, I'd expect those sentences in their workbooks to use a lot of varied language, a variety of language, and correctly use the discourse markers. I expect a varied language because that is one thing on the writing assessment that is very important. Is if you want to score well, if they want to do well, it shows learning, using a strong variety of language. Now, my weakest students, I only want them to use the discourse markers correctly. And if they don't use a lot of variety of language, I'm not going to worry about it, because this is not like a word variety exercise. This is discourse markers. Okay. Now, the middle students, like my biggest group, they're the ones who, depends how I feel about it, what's going on. But what I do is I randomly assign each middle level student to either learn from the stronger student and see exercise more examples of really well done work, or they get randomly assigned to a weaker student and they can show the weaker students, hey, this is what I'm doing, and this is what you can be doing as well. So they're kind of in the middle. They're either learning or they're teaching, but either way, they're doing well. Now, again, I'm not going to show the reading about Helen Keller other than that paragraph, but the basic exercise in our course book would be to reread that text and identify the discourse markers being used. And they had to fill out this little chart. It's not a whole lot, but the idea of this exercise is, can we find these discourse markers, and how do we use the language appropriately? And there's only one correct answer, because part of using discourse marker or any kind of transitional phrases is just what words go together, which words do not go together. And after we've done it for the reading, we've seen examples of it being used in the Helen Keller Act and the Helen Keller reading. Now it's time for students to use these discourse markers by writing sentences. And this is a jigsaw activity, which I'll explain in a moment. But as you can see here, there are six sentences, and each sentence, for the first couple sentences, there's 2 different discourse markers. And the activity is you have to write the sentence using each discourse marker. So you have to write 2 for A, 2 for B, 2 for C. And D and E, you choose 2 for each one, and you write 2 for D, 2 for E as well, 2 sentences. It's a total of 10 sentences. In the interest of time, and also getting my students to work together and just hang and spend, have a more active class atmosphere, I often do something which I will do for this one. The right half of the room, you guys are you work together with the partners if you want to, but you're going to only write a sentence for the first discourse marker in each example. And the left half of the room, you're going to write, the second discourse marker. So that each half writes 5 sentences with discourse markers. But then after that, I tell them, everyone go up, go find someone else who has the other 5, and make sure you copy down their responses into your notebook. So they have examples of it being used, but they're not doing it all themselves, and they're talking to each other. And I do check this in my notebook check. I don't only check for, do you have the one half that your side of the class was responsible for. All right. Now, finally, on the last day, Friday, we go to the computer lab, and this would be like a collaborative reading exercise, again, about famous people, which you'll see. And this one, we're going to read some appropriate level of common lit text. I will explain what common lit is in a moment. And again, more identifying discourse markers being used. Because the big part of, the ESL course, identifying these way we use phrases and then using them ourselves. And then the assessment is going to be kind of a complicated one, or a big assignment. It was a collaborative summary and individualized reading comprehension questions, which you will see in a moment. But first, CommonLit. Now, this is a website, www.commonlit.org. It is a repository of thousands of texts. There's, nonfiction, there's fiction, there's poetry, there's biography, there's news articles, everything, right? And each text has, reading comprehension questions, some multiple choice questions, some free response questions, and they're all graded by level and by Lexile score. So you can see here, I have a text from 4th grade, from 7th grade, from 8th grade. The purple boxes are the Lexile scores. Higher score means more complex language. And these are all biographies. I just, searched the biography section because we're doing famous people. And what I did was I found 3 texts about the same topic, Katherine Johnson, because collaborative reading is an exercise where you give a group of heterogeneous leveled students, so students who have different levels of achievement, different levels of complex text about the same topic. And the idea is that way everyone has something to read at their level that they can comprehend, because in that way they can add to the conversation. They can participate appropriately. We don't want our strongest students doing all the work simply because they're the ones who can read the text well. So my weaker students, they'll get the 4th grade text. My stronger students will get the 8th grade text, okay? It's really basic, but the idea is like, because they're all reading the same material, the same topic, they all have something to contribute, something to say during the collaboration. And the collaboration is a pretty simple exercise. It's going to be just, as a group, they need to write an outline and a 300-word summary about, Katherine Johnson as a person. And generally what happens is, like, the stronger students do end up writing the actual summaries. They do the writing. But because everyone has text they can read, everyone can talk and tell them, oh, we need to write this down, we need to write that down. And with the outline, that is a good way for my weaker students to produce something. If they're like, and sometimes I'll tell them, I need you to do the outline, and you over here, you do the writing. But I want more production from the groups, so I think of ways I can do it for my collaborative reading, my collaborative writing strategies. After they do that, so that's like, they'll do that the first thing in the computer lab after reading it as a group together. Then they move on to the individual work, which is highlighting discourse markers and the reading comprehension. One thing CommonLit does well is students can highlight individual, they can highlight words, passages in the text. They choose the colors, as you can see on the little screenshot there. And I can see their highlights on my teacher account. So I can see them in real time highlighting. So this is part of their grade. They know what participation score is. Are they actually doing the annotation, highlighting, whatever that part of the assignment is for this particular lesson? In this case, it'd be discourse markers. Sometimes it's, ask 2 or 3 questions during the text about something, and I will see their annotations. That's a participation grade. And then they have the reading comprehension about their text. And what I would probably do for this exercise is combine the reading comprehension score with their collaborative reading and collaborative writings, assessment. And that way, students are rewarded for doing well on the individual section, but they're also rewarded for doing well as a group. Because if it was only one or the other, a lot of my students would just focus only on that one because my students are very grade motivated, grade oriented. It's like that. So I try to combine a lot of these exercises together to keep everyone working towards group work, but also the individual work, the individual learning, the group learning. So that's the end of this part of the unit. I mean, this is a longer. I mean, my units are longer than 5 lessons. This is just the introduction to it. I want to thank you for your time. I have a lot more information in the actual unit plan with all my lesson plans. There's my standard. I'm telling you what standards I'm talking from the Cambridge exams. I explain all the activities in more detail. There are more activities that I did not discuss in here just for the sake of time. But yeah, please read into that if you would like to learn more. And once again, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.